Hey everybody, welcome to Dave's World. So I am in the process of putting the Super Cruzes Make My Car More Reliable kit into Darren's car. Darren's a friend of mine and he needed me to work on it because there was all sorts of weird problems happening with the car. This thing had P1101, P0101, evap code, brake pressure code, and I also, after smoke testing the car, I found that the intercooler pipes were also leaking. So I'm putting the metal intercooler pipe in, I'm putting the charge pipe in, I'm putting in the Make My Car More Reliable kit. Part of that is also putting in coils and plugs. It's going to get a PCV reroute.
I'm just going to take a minute to explain what the PCV reroute is. So I came up with a reroute that stops oil from contaminating the intercooler system. Here are two different charge pipe shots showing how much oil can get in. This is inside the intercooler. You can see all the oil and the moisture mixing. Here's a picture of the top of the charge pipe loaded with oil. This came through the turbocharger from the PCV system. This is the top of the intake showing the moisture and oil inside the tube. That little box resonator. This is the inlet on a turbocharger. You can see everything mixed in, and this is what came out of an intercooler that was so loaded it actually couldn't produce boost. So what the PCV reroute does is it catches all of that junk and puts it into an oil separator, which is also known as a catch can, and gives all of this debris a place to go so it stops causing damage and problems with the intake system on a Cruze, Equinox, Malibu, and a Terrain.
Which I'm going to be doing in this video. And what I really wanted to do with this specific video is I isolated changing out the valve cover orifice. The orifice is a regulator that shoots boost pressure into the crankcase, and then after a certain pressure it shuts. And then it also regulates pressure. So when that has a problem, you get all sorts of weird idle problems and airflow issues and lots of different codes. So what I did was isolate that footage, and I'm doing like a valve cover orifice specific replacement video. So that's what this is going to be. And then I'm going to do a whole full video series on upgrading the PCV and things like that. But for right now, let's just focus on doing the orifice, because the orifice is a big job. And then what I'll do is I'm going to throw in where I'm finishing up on this, because I just got the valve cover back in, and now what I'm doing is actually doing the ignition system now. So yeah, enjoy the video. And my apologies. I had to switch computers, so my my audio card isn't the best, so it's a little bit fuzzy at times with my microphone. But again, this is just one video in a series of videos, so the next one I do will have a better microphone. So my apologies on it, but hopefully it's easy to follow along. I tried to upgrade my process a little bit more.
The first thing we need to do is pull the PCV tube out of the way and get it off of the intake, because we're going to have to pull the valve cover, and I have a video showing how to even swap the PCV valves. But let me stop the video for a second and show you why I created the PCV reroute.
So I want to show you something crazy. Everybody thinks this is a catch can because somewhere on the internet someone said it once. This is a resonator, but I want to show you something nuts. Look how much debris is in here, and this is why I made the PCV reroute kit. Look how much comes out of here. That is inside this tube.
Not only is that debris inside the tube, but it also gets into the turbocharger, it gets into the intercooler system, and you could even see how it gets up to the throttle body through the intercooler pipes and gunks up the spark plugs. Okay, so the next thing we're doing is we have to pull the wire harness out of the way. We need to get all the connectors off of the ignition coils. A lot of these connectors have locks, but the locks are broken. So I had to pull all the locks out of the way to get these connectors off. I have to get the ignition coils out of the way. Now, these ignition coils a lot of times get stuck. So on this car, I was able to get 3 out of 4 off. The fourth one ripped. So what I had to basically do was use my pry bar, and I had to use leverage to pop the coils out of the way. But they need to come out of the way so you can get the fuel injectors out of the way. So if you're trying to pull these, be very careful. If you're going to be pulling the valve cover to change the orifice, just get yourself a spare set of coils and some O-rings for your fuel system for the fuel injectors. That way, when you're doing this, you're not stuck and you have to deal with the car misfiring and you have to run out and get a new coil.
Okay, so as you just saw, I don't think these coils have ever been out. They were in there so tight. In fact, one's so stuck, the boot ripped in half. So we're going to have to get that out, and then we're going to have to clean all this out because we don't want any debris getting in the engine, because I'm also doing a tune-up to this car.
As everybody knows, I always keep the struggle in my videos, so I was having a hard time getting this boot out. It was basically welded to the top of the spark plug, but I used a set of needle nose pliers, and you have to grab the boot low enough with enough material that you can yank it hard enough to get it off, and it did eventually come loose, and I just wanted to show you. Now, the next thing we need to do is I did a lot of vacuuming. We have to make sure all of this debris is out of the way, because when I pull the spark plugs out and I pull the tops of the injectors off, you don't want to get any debris inside of those orifices because it will cause engine running issues. In fact, you can damage an injector that way. So on top of that, again, the locks had issues, so I had to use needle nose pliers to get the harness off the injectors, but you want to use the same pliers to pull the connectors off because it's hard to get your hands in there. And then again, make sure you vacuum enough. I'm going to be vacuuming even more later in the video when I swap out the spark plugs. So I have to pull the fuel rail and the fuel line off, but the intercooler pipe is in the way, and I wanted to remove it because I'm also pulling the vacuum pump. The vacuum pump has to come out of the way as well. So you're going to need to remove the 4 bolts on top of the rail, the line from the back of the rail, and then there's 4 bolts on the bottom with some injector, little mini Allen head injector bolts. And then we have to remove the intercooler pipe from the top. There's a clip on the side. Then we need to remove the intercooler pipe from the bottom, and there's usually a bolt on the side, but this one was missing. Also, make sure you remove the tube from the top of the vacuum pump and the overflow tank supply. That way you can pull this pipe out without having to snake it through and possibly damage something.
Okay, so I'm pulling the intercooler pipe for 2 reasons. One is we have to replace this pipe with the full metal one, but also this fuel line, we need to remove the other end of it because it wraps around the valve cover. Because the valve cover is coming off, I have to take the valve cover off to put the orifice in. But I'm also doing the VVTs, and I'm going to be doing this vacuum pump at the same time. So there's a few things going on. And while I'm at it, I'm also changing these PCV valves. It's one here, one there, one there. They're nicknamed PCV valves. They all have different jobs. But for right now, I'm just trying to get everything out of the way so I can get this entire valve cover off. It has to come out to get to the orifice because it's up underneath it, and it's in this vicinity, or at least it should be around there, or it could be in the front, but I'm pretty sure it's in the back. It's a big job. It's a lot of hours. The intercooler pipe, I can't get it from the top, so I'm gonna have to get the car up in the air, and there's a clip on the bottom, and while I'm at it, I'm gonna be removing the charge pipe because we're swapping these both out because we're replacing them with more reliable pipes because these plastic ones are just no good from the factory.
To get to the bottom of the intercooler pipe, you just have to remove all of the 8mm bolts on the back row of the belly pan and just pull down on it.
Okay, so now that I have the bottom panel off, this clip is right here, and we just have to pull it out. And now that it's out, this intercooler pipe will pop right off. All right, so if we look inside the pipe, it is corroded. And if you look at the side of the pipe right there, you can see all the oil that's coming out. If oil is coming out, that means air is coming out, which is part of the reason why this thing's running like crap. Now you can see that this metal pipe is designed to be in here. It's perfectly sized to fit in this area for this car. I'm not ready to install it yet because I have another problem I need to diagnose. Okay, one of the problems this car has is a brake pressure sensor issue. This is the brake pressure sensor. It's right here on the booster. And because it's such a pain in the ass to get to, I kind of want to change it while I'm in here working.
Even if I didn't want to, I have to remove the vacuum pump from the side of the valve cover because it's driven off the camshaft. So if you do not remove it, the valve cover will be stuck. In this situation, the pump is actually bad, so I am swapping it out, and it ended up being actually very clogged with debris in the oil. So it's a good thing I removed it. And be very careful if you remove yours, because if you're reusing it, the fitting on top is very brittle, and you do not want to crack the plastic. At this point, what I like to do is remove the entire wire harness and get it out of the way of the valve cover. So as I'm lifting the valve cover, the wire harness cannot get caught on it, and at the same time, if there's any debris on the harness, I don't want to be able to knock it off into the where the camshafts are above the head, so the debris can stay out as well.
Okay, the next thing we're going to have to do is pull all the valve cover bolts off the perimeter of the valve cover and in the center of the valve cover. I'm also going to be changing the wastegate and a few other things, so I'm taking things off that don't need to be taken off to do this job because I have a lot of things to do to this car.
Even though I am removing other parts because I have other upgrades to add to the vehicle, the valve cover bolts obviously still have to come off because you have to remove the valve cover. So I'm removing all of these bolts. I'm putting them all in a safe place. Now, if you have there's like wedge inserts, the valve cover bolts could actually stay in the valve cover. But I had to flip it over to do the orifice, and I was worried about them falling out just in case one of them may have been missing because I don't know the history of this engine. So don't assume those bolts are going to stay in. So I always pull them all out. After I pulled out the valve cover bolts, I saved the fuel injectors for last because I didn't want any debris falling into the injectors. So that's why I did those last before I pulled the valve cover. All right, so at this point, I'm pulling the lower 4 bolts that hold the bottom of the rail in. These, again, have wedges in there so the bolts can't fall out, but I like to pull them out of the way just in case. And then there are 8 little Allen head bolts that hold the tops of the fuel rail lines to the tops of the injectors. You want to take those out too. Be careful, they have Loctite. You don't want to snap them. And then make sure you have the exact tool that's supposed to go into the top of the Allen because you don't want to round them out or mess them up because if they get stuck in there, it's a nightmare getting them out. And if any of them are messed up, buy new ones. Do not reuse them.
Okay, we're getting all these little bolts out, and then that'll free up the caps for the injectors.
Okay, so now that the bolts are all out, you want to lift the rail up evenly. If you don't lift it up evenly, you can bend them, and then when you try to put it back together, the tubes might not line up correctly. You can cause injector leaks, so you do not want that to happen. At this point, I'm pulling out the harness, and we have a coolant tube that's in the way, so you want to get the coolant tube out of the way. And then I had a problem. This valve cover was on here so strong that it was practically welded on. What ended up happening was the dowels were stuck, and you had to lift it up a certain way and put pressure on it a certain way that the dowels would release evenly so this thing would come up. I'll show you in the next scene what I had to do. So after messing around with this thing for like 15 minutes, what I ended up doing was applying a little bit of pressure to each corner over and over again for about an additional 10 minutes. And what started happening is the dowels started releasing. So once I got the dowels to start releasing, you cannot pry up just on one side. You have to pry up on each side evenly to get this valve cover to lift up correctly. And my advice too is if you're pulling the valve cover, I should have taken the wastegate out of the way. It would have been a little easier, but either way, I was able to get it out.
That is loaded with oil. So this is pretty much what the orifice looked like in there. It's packed solid and has, I don't know, what, 1/16, 1/8 of an inch worth of carbon buildup above it. And then this is what it's supposed to look like. So it's obvious that air definitely can't make it through there. And this is what causes the P1101 and a few other issues. So what I'm finding is any place the oil travels has a lot of carbon buildup. And this is what causes the throttle body to get gunked up. It's what causes the intercooler to get gunked up, and the spark plugs. Pretty much anywhere the oil travels, this will gunk up, including the brake system, because the vacuum pump has oil travel through it as well. So my PCV reroute is what prevents this from happening. Yeah, you can see here with the smoke tester that where the orifice comes out of the valve cover, or I should say out of the head through the valve cover, it's a straight shot to the intake. That's why we're seeing smoke coming out of the intake.
You could see right here why my PCV reroute for the Gen 2 Cruze, the Malibu, and the Equinox is so important. Between pressure being pushed into the crankcase and vacuum being pulled by the turbo and the intake manifold, oil circulates everywhere, so that's why I have an oil separator catching everything. Alright, so the next step is getting the inner and outer valve cover gaskets in. Now there is a vacuum pump seal that I need to change later, which I will do. I can just pop it out and install it later. So you're seeing that I'm making sure the gasket's nice and tight, and then when you flip it upside down, you want to make sure the gasket's not going to fall out. The orifice pops right in. When you drop the orifice in place, you'll actually feel it click. And then we're just going to flip it over and drop it in place and tighten everything down. you want to make sure when you drop it in place that the dowels, basically when you drop it down, you want to make sure the dowels let it drop in place correctly. And I even took a hammer and started tapping around to make sure the valve cover dropped down evenly. Now what I'm doing is putting all of the bolts in place. I want to make sure they're all exactly where they need to be. And then I want to make sure they all thread in a little bit just so I can make sure there's no cross threading and no debris in the threads that are going to cause any problems. And once I get them all pretty much started, then what I'm going to do is tighten everything in a circular motion from the center of the valve cover out. And I usually use a very low torque spec, maybe 1 pound, just to get everything seated. And then, I could feel it by hand. But, if you go online, I found this website, cruzehelp.com, that had a really nice torque sequence. So if you don't know what the torque sequence should be, you can just follow this diagram. And Cruze Help is a pretty cool site. It looks like a young site, but it has a lot of information in it already. And then, but if you torque them down and you want to use an actual torque setting, I believe it was 11 foot-pounds. And then you're just going to torque in the same sequence. But I use my own sequence because I've been working on engines for years. So once I finish torquing everything down, then I'm going to end up putting the fuel system together and vacuuming a little bit more as well. All right, so I'm doing even more vacuuming because what I want to do is swap the injector O-ring, and then there's a little shim under the O-ring. And while I'm in there messing around, I didn't want any debris to move around and get caught underneath the top of the rail. So always vacuum out anything you can. And then I use rubber gloves because when you touch gasoline, it makes it like soaks into the pores on your hands and just makes your hands reek. But what I tried to use was needle nose pliers to pull out the shims because they're brittle. Each shim just ended up exploding. So they just busted to a couple pieces. So, after I was done pulling the shims off, I just vacuumed again. And then the new shims kind of rotate in place, and then you put the new O-ring in place. My suggestion is maybe keep the shims in place, but at least replace the O-rings, because the shims are such a pain in the butt that these, for a novice, might be really difficult. But at the end of the day, if you keep the shims but put new O-rings in, at least you can seal the injector pipes to the rail without having to worry about them leaking. I do suggest doing both, but again, if it's too difficult, just leave the old shims in place. Once you replace the shims and O-rings, you can drop the fuel rail into place. What I tried to do is very evenly lower everything down. It wasn't 100% pushed into place, but then I used the larger bolts above the injectors and I ran them down lightly, maybe 1 pound each. And what that did was pull the pipes down onto the top of the injectors. And then what I did was evenly put all of the hold down Allen head bolts into place, and I ran those down evenly, and I tried to be as even as possible before I tightened everything down, because you don't want to mess up any of the bolts, you don't want to mess up the Allen heads, and you want to make sure everything is nice and even, so when everything clamps down into place, it has a nice tight seal, and you don't have to worry about anything leaking, because God forbid it leaks. The injectors are right next to the coils, and you don't want gasoline to get into your coils and, God forbid, catch everything on fire. So be very careful when you're installing all of these things. Okay, so remember, this video was originally about swapping the orifice, so I decided to throw one more final thing in, and it's this vacuum pump seal. The reason I threw this in the video is because if you're pulling the valve cover, and you maybe couldn't find the seal or didn't think about getting the seal and you want to do it on a later date, this is something you can do without pulling the valve cover if done correctly. Now, you see, I'm trying to pull this seal out and it's split in half. So that's the reason I'm showing this in slower motion, is I wanted to show you like with the things I was doing trying to get the seal out. I tried using a pick, I tried using a pry bar, and really what I ended up doing was taking a long flathead screwdriver, wedging it behind the base of the seal and tapping lightly to where I got a little bit under the seal, and then I was able to pry and get the seal to basically pop out. And then, once it was out of the way, I put the new seal in place, which the one I bought actually fit really nice. Make sure you clean everything out, and then after you know where the seal is going in is perfectly clean, you can pop the new seal in Now, usually you're supposed to use a seal driver, but I've been doing this for so long, I just always use a rubber mallet and then maybe a little hammer, and I tap them in evenly just because I know what it should look like. A lot of seal locations have a stop, but sometimes, seals aren't always made the correct way. At least if it might not hit the stop, but at least if you know what it's supposed to look like, you can put it in by eye. My advice is to also pop the ECM out of the way. It just has 2 clips and you can slide it out of the way. So it gave me room to move the hammer, so as I'm swinging it, it wasn't hitting the ECM. After you put the seal in, the next step is dropping the vacuum pump in place. When you slide it into place, you have to make sure that the cam gear inside the pump is lined up with the cam keyway that's on the actual camshaft. If you don't have it lined up correctly, the pump will not slide in the right way and you can't line the dowels up. So at least if you get it in there and you can work the pump and you can feel how far it's moving, you can get it to rotate just right and then pop into the dowels. So after you do that, it'll basically hold itself in place. The seal will seal the shaft, and this will hold the pump to the side of the valve cover. And on this car, the pump is so blocked up with debris that we just decided to put a brand new pump in place. So the final thing that I'm throwing in this video is I'm putting in the intercooler pipe, but the Super Cruzes version is a solid metal pipe. This is a great upgrade because the factory ones crack and cause all sorts of like air fuel ratio codes and airflow codes. This car has a lot of lean and switching to rich codes because of the airflow problems. It actually has multiple problems. So I'm showing the metal intercooler upgrade because this will actually solve a lot of the leaks, and because this car has multiple problems with P1101, P0101, and then P0172, P0171, it has a few problems, and I wanted to show some of the upgrades that I'm doing to help prevent these future issues. So that's why I'm putting in this pipe as well, and I'm also putting in the Make My Car More Reliable kit, and this customer also wanted the upgraded intercooler pipe because I found a lot of leaking on the plastic pipe.